Have you ever heard of a woman who ended a war while the enemy slept? Not with an army, not with a sword, not with rage or shouting, but with silence, with precision, with a single tool meant for holding a tent in place. Who was this woman? Why did a powerful general trust her with his life? Why did he close his eyes in her presence? And how did one quiet moment inside an ordinary tent bring peace to an entire nation for 40 years? Israel had been here before. A familiar cycle, disobedience, silence, suffering. Not because God had grown weak, but because the people had grown distant. After years of peace, Israel slowly drifted. Altars once raised to the Lord stood neglected. Gratitude faded into routine. And what begins as forgetfulness often ends as bondage. So God allowed what Israel feared most. From the north rose a power unlike any they had faced before. His name was Jabin, king of Hazor, one of the strongest cities in the region. But Jabin did not rule by diplomacy or mercy. His authority was enforced by terror. At the center of that terror stood one man, Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, architect of oppression, the face of fear. Sisera did not need to conquer Israel in one decisive blow. He crushed them slowly, methodically, relentlessly. 900 iron chariots rolled through the land, massive, unstoppable machines of war. Against them, Israel had no defense, no standing army, no weapons to match iron. So the people learned to hide. Villages emptied at the sound of approaching wheels. Fields were abandoned. Roads fell silent. Parents taught their children not how to fight, but how to disappear. Life became survival. Crops were seized. Homes were raided. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak prayed to be overlooked. Israel lived in their own land like strangers, waiting for nightfall, wondering if morning would come. And perhaps the most painful question of all echoed through their hearts. Where is God now? 20 years passed like this. 20 years of fear. 20 years of oppression. 20 years of unanswered cries. At least, that's how it felt. But heaven was not silent. God had not turned away. He had been watching, listening, waiting for the right moment to act. And when that moment came, he did not raise up a king. He did not summon a warrior from a palace. He did not choose the strongest man in Israel. He chose a woman, not yet on the battlefield, not yet in the spotlight, but seated beneath a palm tree, listening for God's voice while the nation trembled. Because when fear rules the land, God begins his work quietly, and the cries of the oppressed never fall on deaf ears. God has not forgotten me. Even when fear surrounds me, God is still in control. Oppression does not have the final word. Deliverance does. What feels like silence is often preparation. This is not legend. This is not folklore. This is not a story shaped by imagination. This is biblical history. Today's story takes us into a dark chapter of Israel's past, a time when fear ruled the land, when power crushed the weak, and when hope felt like a distant memory. A time when God chose not a king, not a warrior, not an army, but a woman history barely noticed. A frightened man on the run. A ruthless general who had terrorized a nation. A prophetess who heard God's voice when others heard only silence. A commander who hesitated when it was time to lead. And a tent-dwelling woman, living quietly on the edge of history. Her name was Jael. His name was Sisera. And between them stood a prophecy that could not be undone. Sisera was a warlord, feared, ruthless, untouchable. The sound of his iron chariots alone was enough to send villages into hiding. For 20 long years, Israel lived under his shadow, not fighting, not resisting, just surviving. Jael was the opposite. She had no rank, no title, no weapon forged for war. She lived a quiet life, moving tents, drawing water, keeping to herself. The kind of woman history usually passes over without a second glance. And yet, heaven had already chosen her. Somewhere between prophecy and panic, between fear and faith, between a battlefield soaked in rain and a tent standing silently in the wilderness, God was setting the stage. Because this story is not just about violence. It is not just about victory. It is about how God works when strength fails, how deliverance comes when courage hesitates, and how ordinary hands can be used to do extraordinary things. Before the tent peg was lifted, before the hammer struck, before the prophecy was fulfilled, Israel was drowning in fear. And that is where the story truly begins. Say this quietly to yourself. I am not invisible to God. I am not too small, too ordinary, or too overlooked to be used. God sees me where I am, and He can work through what I already have. Even in seasons of fear, God is preparing purpose. While fear silenced the land, there was one place in Israel where voices still rose, not in panic, but in discernment. In the hill country of Ephraim, beneath the shade of a palm tree, sat a woman unlike any other in her time. Her name was Deborah. She was not hidden behind palace walls. She did not command troops from a fortified city. She sat where the people could reach her, where truth could be spoken plainly. Deborah was a judge of Israel. In a world where leadership was almost always male, God placed authority in her hands. Not because men were absent, but because courage had grown scarce. When others hesitated, Deborah listened. When others feared, Deborah discerned. She was also a prophetess. God spoke, and she heard. Not dreams shaped by emotion, not opinions dressed as revelation, but words that carried weight, words that came from heaven. The people came to her with disputes, with confusion, with fear. They came seeking clarity in a time clouded by oppression. And Deborah judged with wisdom, not force. Her authority did not come from weapons. It came from alignment with God. While Sisera ruled the land with iron chariots, Deborah ruled with truth. She understood something others had forgotten, that God does not lose control when His people suffer, and that deliverance always begins with obedience. One day, the word of the Lord came to her, not as comfort, but as command. It was time to stop hiding. It was time to confront fear. It was time for Israel to rise. So Deborah sent for a man named Barak, a military leader from the tribe of Naphtali. He was capable, experienced, strong, but like many in Israel, he had grown used to surviving instead of believing. Deborah spoke with certainty. Has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you? This was not a suggestion. This was not a possibility. This was a divine directive. God was calling Barak to gather 10,000 men and march toward Mount Tabor. God Himself would draw Sisera into battle. God Himself would hand the enemy over. Victory was promised,